Let's learn how to work with Azure and deploy a Visual Studio ASP.NET application and database that we've created. So the first thing that we're going to do is go to a website that allows us to create our Azure account. And so that website is azure.microsoft.com/en-us/education. Now we're creating an educational account since this is for our class, and then you're going to come over here and click on sign in, and under sign in you'll choose some account that maybe you're working with. So we'll go ahead and type in whatever account you have, and I'll come back after I go through this process. And since it's our BYU account, I clicked entered in a BYU email address, and I clicked next, and it takes you to the BYU website where you're going to enter your NetID and your password, and then click on sign NetID and your BYU NetID password. It will take you to the Microsoft Azure web page, and this is where we can actually start working with Azure to create a site that we can upload our Visual Studio account. Here you're going to want to go ahead and click on free account if there is one there. I've already created one, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult, but you'll create a free account, and after you've created that free account you'll have your own portal, and then you'll be able to click on portal and it will take you to a portal site. So back on that other page, just look for the links that talk about creating a free account. Unfortunately, I already did that and it doesn't allow me to go back and redo it. So you might have to stumble your way through that and get some help from the TAs or myself in helping you. Now that we've created a portal, we can come to our portal and we can do whatever we want. For instance, we could create a SQL database. So we could do a create resource, and we could create a database, and there's our SQL database right there. So we could create a brand new SQL database, and it will ask for the database name. I'm going to go ahead and type in my database name as being NBA, and it's going to be Azure for Students, and a resource group. We don't have anything, so I'm going to type in IS403 BYU, and we want to go ahead and create a blank database, or we could pull in a backup. Let's just create a blank database to start with and leave the rest the way it is and click create. And we need to give it a resource name. We need to click new. Sorry about that. Give it a new resource name, BYU IS403. Click OK. And let's see, we have to go choose a server name. So let's call our server name BYU IS403, and it'll create that for us. Go ahead and give it an admin login, and I'm just going to go with the default admin, and the password will be capital G O lowercase o Cougars 1, capital G little o Cougars 1. Location is going to be Central US, and let's go ahead, and we're not going to worry about that. Leave the not now checked. Admin says you have to have the following requirements. So when we put in an admin for our admin login, doesn't really seem to like that because it's saying it doesn't have white spaces and symbols. So let's go ahead and do something that's not the typical. It says not the typical, like admin or administrator or SA. Those are ones you see in your regular Visual Studio. So I'm going to go ahead and use BYU IS403, and we'll leave the password go Cougar1 and go Cougar1. And now we can have that. We click select. You can save that if you want to save it. We come back over to here. Everything looks good, so click create. SQL Server will then go out and try to create the database. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording while it does that. So when you're done, you click on SQL Databases, and if it doesn't show up, wait for a little bit and it might show up, or you might have to click on the refresh. So I now have a SQL Server database created out in Azure. Now what I want to do is I want to go and modify that database. In order for us to work with this, we'd like to really use it in our SQL Server Management Studio that we've already installed in the past. So make sure you've clicked on your database, and now that you see your database, you should see this information. If you don't, let me go ahead and back up. Just click on your database. You see the information. Now click on Set Server Firewall. And now that you're in the Set Server Firewall, what you want to do is you want to come over here and click on Add Client IP, which will add your information right here. Click Save. It's updating the firewall rules. It's successful right here. Go ahead and close. Come back over to here, and you need to copy this name of the server. So what you could do is just click on this little button that says Copy, and now go over to SQL Server Management Studio and open up SQL Server Management Studio. And when it runs, it's going to prompt us to enter in our server name. And so that's where you're going to paste in this new server name that you just copied. So paste in the new server name, and then here it might say Windows Authentication. You want to choose SQL Server Authentication. And then you're going to type in the login. Remember, we created a login that called it BYU IS403, and we said that the password was Go Cougars 1. Click Connect. And now this will be able to access that server out on Azure. And if I click on Databases, there's my MBA database I just created. Now I have the ability to go in and create tables. So let's go ahead and do that next. I'm going to go to our Learning Suite course, and there's a link called Entity Framework Tutorial. We're going to build that application in MVC and also create the database. So click on Entity Framework Tutorial, and then we're going to scroll down, and there's a part where we create the database, which we already did. We called our database NBA. Now let's go ahead and create the table. So I'm going to copy this code for the team, come back over to here, right mouse click on Tables, and we'll say New. Actually, let's just do it through a query because I copied that SQL statement. We'll say New Query, and we're already pointed at NBA right here. Paste that query in, click Execute. And that created one table. Let's come back over to here, and we could go ahead and grab the next table, come back, paste that in, execute. Grab the next table, copy the query, paste that in, and execute. If I come over here to Tables, we now have 3 tables created in our NBA database out in Azure. So the next thing I want to do is now add data to those tables. I'll go ahead and close that window. And let's do the following. Let's go ahead and open up the player table. Right mouse click Player and choose Edit Top 200 Rows. We'll see that there's no data in that, and we will type in the following data for our table. Now you don't have to start with data in the database tables, but we're just doing it to save time. So I'm going to go ahead and type in some data, and hopefully you'll see those values. I'm going to type in 1, and player last name, we'll do Jones. Let's do all uppercase. We want to be consistent. Player first name, Bob. Position is guard. Team ID 1. And we'll go and change these values a little bit later. Player 2, last name is Smith. First name will be Buckwheat. Position will be forward. That'll be team 2. Player 3 will be Anderson. Player first name will be Oli. Position code will be a forward center. So I typed in FC, and that will also be team 1. Let's add another player. We'll add a couple more. You can make up the data. I'm just making up data. Last name will be Rascal. First name will be Little, and definitely a guard. That'll be team 3. And then our last player we'll just add 5 records. The name will be Pooh, and the first name will be Winnie, and that person's position will be a center, and they will be on team 2. So I just added 5 records to the NBA table, and you can add whatever data you want. I'm going to go ahead and close that table down, and I'm going to open up position table and edit 200 rows, and I'm going to add data there. Now what I'm going to do for that, this will be a lookup table for positions. The first position code will be a G for guard. Second position will be F for forward. Third position will be C for center, spelled correctly. And then I will have a GF for guard / forward. And I will have a CF for center / forward. And that will be my data for the position table. And so if you want to type that in, go ahead. When I'm done, I close that table, and the last one I'm going to add data for will be the team. Edit the top 200 rows, and I'm going to come in, and the first team I'll add, team 1. Team name will be Utah space Jazz. Team 2 will be Denver space Nuggets. And team 3 will be Oklahoma Thunder. And I like to make all my data either upper or lowercase. I like to be consistent. So there's my data that I have for my team and my players and my position. So I've got data loaded up in my tables, which is loaded up in my database, which is stored out on Azure. Now let's go ahead and go create our Visual Studio application to talk to the Azure database. Let's go ahead and create a brand new Microsoft MVC application. So file new project, and we want it to be a .NET framework, and let's call it Azure Sample. Click OK, and we want an MVC application. Click OK, and this will go ahead and create our MVC application for us. So here's our project. I closed a little default window that opened up. And within this project, now we want to go ahead and create some scaffolded views. But before we do that, we need to tell our project that it needs to work with our entity framework. So let's go to our project. One way to do it is right mouse click and choose the Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. And we see what we have installed there. We come over to Browse, and we need to make sure we bring in the entity framework. So click on Entity Framework, attach it to the project, click Install. This will go and install it. Click OK, click I accept, and now we're going to have database access within our MVC project we just made. Now that we have our database access entity framework installed, we'll go ahead and close that window. And we want to work with our connection string and go to our web config. So let's go to our web config. Notice it's the web config for the project, not under views. And within our web config for our project, we want to add a new section. So I added this new connection string, and I'm going to give it a name of NBA context, and it's going to be a SQL client. Now we need to go get the connection string for that database we made in Azure. So let's go back over to Azure. Let's look at connection strings here, and we can copy this connection string. We'll come back over to here, paste it in. Now the one thing I don't like on this, but we're going to go ahead and do it for now, is we want to go ahead and enter in the user ID and the password for this project. So for right now, we're just going to go ahead and we'll do it the way I don't really like to do it, but we're going to do it for the sake of simplicity. And I'm just going to grab that user ID bracket, including the brackets. And remember, we said our user ID was BYU IS403, I believe. If we come back over to our Azure's portal, we can take a look at that and see what we typed in. And we remember it was actually lowercase BYU IS403, and we said that our password was capital G Cougars 1. And so there was our ID and our password. And really our user ID, the case doesn't matter. And actually that's the wrong number. That's supposed to be 403, BYU IS403, and the password does matter. That's case sensitive. Case didn't matter over here. Now that's not really a great way to do it because I'm putting that in my web config, and that just sort of feels like a security nightmare waiting to happen. But maybe we can learn a little bit later how we could not supply it there and supply it somewhere else. So now let's go and create a model. We'll right mouse click on model, and we're going to choose add a class, and that will be team.cs. And I'm just going to paste some code that I've already written before. So I paste that in for the model, team, and we say it's going to point to a table called team, and the primary key will be team ID and have another property called team name. Let's go ahead and resolve those errors, and it will bring in the necessary libraries that we want to work with in our using clause. Same thing with the key, and we'll save that. And now let's go build another model, and let's build it for the position table and build it for the player table. So once again, I come to models, right mouse click, add class. We'll call it the position.cs model, and I'll go ahead and just paste in my code and fix the errors that I have by adding using clauses. And this model now points to the position table. We'll save that, and let's go do it one more time. And in this case, we'll add a class, and we're going to call it the player.cs model. And I spelt that incorrectly. And the best way to fix that, rather than doing a rename since I haven't done anything, is just delete that model and redo it. So we'll do an add class player, spelled correctly, .cs, and I'll paste in my code I've already written, resolve the errors, and once again this will now point to the player table and the structure that I set up earlier in my SQL Server Management Studio. Now that I have all the models in place, let's go ahead and do a build, make sure we don't have any errors. One other thing we could do, instead of doing this little player like this, we could actually set up what they call navigational properties. So I'm going to change this model. Currently it says we have a player ID, a last name, a first name, a position code, and a team ID. These are actually foreign keys to another table, and I can set them up as what we call a navigational property. So I'm going to paste in this code instead, and let's take a look at it. So I still have my player ID as the key and the player first name, the player last name, but now take a look at position code. We said position code is a virtual attribute of this table, and it's a foreign key to the position table, and we can also bring in the position record associated with this player ID linked to the position table through the position code. And we'll do the same thing with the team. We're going to take the team ID from this record, and we're going to link it to the team table as a foreign key, and that gives us access to the team record. So now we could actually pull back the team name and the position description in those other tables because we've set them up as a navigational property, and that's how you'd set it up. Next thing we want to do is we want to go modify our global ASAX file. Now this is the file that gets called when the application starts. So the first thing we want to do is we want to add a couple using statements. We want to add a using for our project name, which is Azure Sample .models. And let's go add one more. We're going to say Azure Sample, which is the name of our project, and we're going to type in a folder called DAL. And that's going to be a folder that we're going to go make. And so don't worry about the error right now. Don't try to compile it because you get an error. It'll mess things up, so just let it be. Right? Pull a Beatles and let it be. So next thing we're going to do is we want to come into our global ASAX file, which is called when the application first starts, and we want to type in database.set initializer less than sign, the name of our context string, which we said was MBA context, and then we'll put parenthesis null. Now if you notice we get an error on this, and we need to right mouse click and resolve that, and we need to use the system data entity, and it would help if I spelt that correctly. And then our context, we right mouse click on our context and it says generate a class. Don't worry yet. That's because we haven't created this. We wrote it in our connection string, but we haven't made the code yet. So just let those two errors be for right now. And let's go ahead and save the project. Now let's understand what this database set initializer does. In Visual Studio, you can actually do what they call code first. And that allows you to create code and then go generate databases and tables built upon that. It's a great thing and it can help people get their project done. You also lose a lot of control over what happens in the system if you turn it over to Visual Studio to create all the code. By us saying set database set initializer NBA context null, what we're doing is we're disabling initializers, saying we want to have full control over how the database is created and used. So it's a way that you can have more control yourself. So let's go ahead and save that, and we're going to move on. Now let's come over to our folder, our project, Azure Sample, right mouse click, and we're going to add a new folder. And in this new folder, we're going to call it DAL, and I like to call mine DAL because it means something to me. It means Data Access Layer. And in a three-tier project, Model Views and Controllers, we have a data layer, a presentation layer, and a business layer. The data layer controls the database, the presentation layer controls the views, and the business layer controls the logic, or like controllers. So now that we're in here, let's go ahead and create a brand new class in that folder. Right mouse click, add class, and we want to make a class called NBA context.cs, which that matches our connection string and also matches the name we just said we were going to use in our database set initializer. Click add, and then I want to put the following code in this file. So by default it made a class called NBA context, but here's what we really need it to be. We need it to be NBA context inherited from DB context. I'm going to go ahead and resolve that. And then we say, well, let's go ahead and make a public constructor, and that's going to call our base constructor for NBA context. And then we want to create some database sets. And we're going to create a database set called teams based upon the team model. And let's go ahead and resolve that by bringing in our models. And then we make a players database set based upon the player model, and positions based upon the position model. Now what Visual Studio did here is something called pluralization. Pluralization. And that's where it took the model name and pluralized it, put an S on it, to use that as the variable in our database context to access the list of records from the team table. So that's pluralization. Next thing we want to do, let's go ahead and save it, and let's build and see if we have any errors. And that should resolve those other errors that we already had before. And the build succeeded, so that's a good sign. Now that we have our model in place, let's go ahead and create some scaffolded items. So we're going to do this by going to our controllers folder, and we already have a home controller that was automatically built for us. That home controller has an index, about, and contact method. But let's go to controller, right mouse click, add, and we want to choose a new controller. But instead of doing empty, we want to choose an MVC controller with views using the entity framework. And this is going to go make controllers and views for us. Model class, let's go ahead and do the player class, and we'll build that upon our context. And we want it to generate all of our views associated with it, and it's going to make the controller called the player's controller. We'll click add, and it will go generate that new controller called player's controller and create the views for us. And then we're going to repeat this process for our team controller or our team table, team model, and the position model. So here is the player controller that the system just made, and look what it did. First of all, it created a private attribute in this class called DB of type NBA context, and it called the constructor. That means that when we access this controller, it will automatically create the database for us using the connection from the web config file that we made. This says if we ever call the index action method, we're going to go to the database, go to the player's DB set, which remember that's linked to the player's table, and let's include all of the positions and the teams. And we're going to return it back to that variable, and then we're going to return that variable as a list of data to the index view. And we have one for details, and we have one for create, and we have one for edit, and we have posts, and we have HTTP gets. And it generated all of this code for us. So that's quite exciting. Let's go do the same thing. Right mouse click on controller, add, controller, and we want to do the views using the entity framework. Once again, choose the model. This time we want to do position. We've already got our context set up. Click add. It will now generate our positions controller and all the views associated with it. And if you notice, it's the same thing where we have an index, details, creates, deletes, and if you actually scroll down and look at the views, notice that it's creating all these views too. A create view, delete, details, edit, index. Same thing for positions. Let's do this one more time with our controller. Right mouse click, controller, and we want to do add, controller, with the entity framework, and this time we want to use the team model, which is going to make the teams controller. We have our data context class, and that will go out and automatically make our connection string work with the database, and then work with our DB set of teams, which was the attribute that was pluralized, working with the records of the team models, which was linked to the team table. So now we have all this information. I can save it. I can build it. And it built. And let's go ahead and run this program. Now remember, where is the database stored? The database is actually stored out on Azure. We're hosting our website on our local machine, but the database is on Azure. And it's going to come up with the default landing page because we did an MVC application, and you can go change that landing page. And once the landing page comes up, let's just go over here and try it out. Let's say teams, because that's the controller name. Remember that? It said teams controller, players controller, position controller. And now it goes out and it hits Azure and pulls our database back. and it pulls the tables for team, and I could click on edit and Utah Jazzers and save, and it modifies that. Or I could go to the Nuggets and I could delete. It says, do you want to delete it? Yes, delete, and it's gone. And remember, once again, this is data that's being stored out on the web in Azure. And we could look at your positions table, the same thing we did there. Positions, which goes to the positions controller. We could look at the players, which goes to the players controller and shows the information. And it looks like I didn't put a position for Oli. And if I click on edit there, well, we said he was a center. Let's try guard and see if it shows up. And that does show up, so we probably had an error in data that I typed in, that it didn't understand the code. Nice that it creates our drop-down list for us too, though. Center forward. It probably looks like I didn't enter a code right for center, because if I save that, oh, it works now. So I guess we're okay. Maybe there's something wrong, but it fixed. So here we have data that we're working with. Now that we have data out on the internet, and we have a website that we can work with on our local host, let's learn how to publish this out to Azure also. So then we'll have our website out on Azure along with our database. So let's go ahead and go to Build, and we want to publish our project we just made. So when we look at the publish, we have what they call an app service, which allows us to create a new Azure app service. And we can do a create new or an Azure virtual machine or FTP. Go ahead and leave it on an app service, create new, click publish. It's going to look with whatever is associated with your Visual Studio. Now, if this isn't the same account that you have with Visual Studio, let me cancel. Then what you need to do is come out to help, and you want to register your product. And right here, you want to add an account and add that account that we use to create your Azure service. So you'd click Add Account, and then you would add your new account there. So let's go back to Build, Publish, and we are going to do, let's see, you're not coming back. Here we go. Build, Publish, and there we go. App Service, Create New. If you take a look at the advanced, it simply says, do you want a release mode? What's the context? Do we go ahead and use the web config? And we want to leave all that the way it is. Other things that we could do is exclude certain files, but we just want to leave that the way it is. Leave it for release. Click Save. Create New. Click Publish. It then says, here's an app name that it can call, and a resource group. If you don't have something in there, you could click New and type in a new resource group name. I typed in the name BYU Fantasy Basketball. It needs to be unique, so type something in there. In fact, I'll type in BYU IS403, BYU IS403 Fantasy Basketball. Click OK. That's my new resource group I'm making. And the hosting plan, if there's not something in the hosting plan, you can click New, and it will go grab information here. Click OK, brings it back in. Don't worry about application insights. They do say it's recommended for analytics. We're not going to worry about that. We've already created the database, and we've created the storage account, and we're using Azure for Students. So type something in those fields and click Create. And it's now going to go out to your system and create what they call the app service that will reside on Azure and will be used to host web and mobile applications. Now, we could have done the same thing over in Azure. We could have gone out there and actually created the service. So let's see when this comes back, and it says deploying step 1. So let's just watch what happens. So it's now taken me to a new screen, and it's currently in the publish mode. and it's given us what the URL would be, so we'll just wait until it finishes publishing and we'll go from there. And you can actually watch down here in the output, and you can see what's happening on the publish, that it's publishing our project out to that Azure sample. And we could have given that a different name. I just let the system do that, which is sort of a crummy name, but we could have called it whatever we wanted as long as it was unique. And so it's still just publishing and copying everything out. And now it said publish succeeded. That's a good sign. Here's the URL. I can copy that URL to the clipboard and come out here, and it's already trying to run our website. So it's loading it up right now, and once it loads, we'll go from there. First time usually takes the longest. And lo and behold, here's our website out on the internet. And I could put my slash and go to my Teams controller, which would take me to my Teams index view, and that's going to go and grab the Azure database of the teams and display that. Now remember, once again, this is also a free account we're using with Azure. It's a student account, so don't expect a whole lot, but look, there's our data. And remember, it did work because we used to have Denver Nuggets in there. Could I add a new one? Let's see. Team name, Denver Nuggets. Create. Error occurred. So we do have some problems we might have to go fix with adding of data. Let's see if we can actually delete data. Let's go to our players controller. Spelled correctly would help because it's going right off of our controller name. And it's going and resolving that for the very first time. And let's see if we can edit any data. We'll say that Oli is now a forward, and that does work. So we probably would have to go and look at our code to see about creating new and see if we're actually adding the right things. But we can edit data, we can look at data. So we do have some things we'd have to fix, but there we have an internet app out there deployed to Azure on the web, so family and friends can see it and think how cool you are. Anyway, that's how we create a web application and deploy our database and create our database and have SQL Server Management Studio talk to our database and have Visual Studio deploy our app out to the web.